The woman was lying face down in the snow at the edge of Callan Vor's eastern pasture when he rode out to check the fence line on the coldest morning of 1883. He almost did not see her. The light was still gray and thin, and the snow had drifted against the cedar posts in long, smooth shoulders that made everything below them look like more of the same. But his horse Abel stopped without being asked, and Callan had learned over 14 years of working this land to trust what Abel stopped for. He dismounted and walked the last 40 feet on foot. She was not dead. He could see that from 10 feet out, the faint fog of breath rising from the snow beside her face. She was dressed for travel, but not for weather like this. A wool coat that had been good once and was not good now, boots that had seen too many miles, a canvas bag still strapped across her back as if she had gone down mid-stride and simply not gotten up again. Her hair had come loose from its pins and lay dark and wet against her cheek. One hand was stretched forward in the snow, fingers open, reaching toward the post line as if she had been trying to get to the other side of it when her legs gave out. Callan stood over her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he crouched down, got his arms under her, and lifted. She stirred when he settled her across Abel's back, made a sound that was almost a word, and then was not, and went still again. He walked the horse back to the house at a pace that would not jostle her, and tried not to think too hard about what he was going to do when he got there. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who assessed the situation in front of him and acted on what he found. What he found was a woman who weighed less than she should and had been lying in below zero cold long enough that her lips had gone the color of a winter sky. The assessment was clear. The action was clear. He brought her inside and got to work. He pulled the spare room mattress close to the stove and got her out of the coat and the wet boots and wrapped her in every blanket the house had, which was 4, and then he boiled water and filled the 2 stone crocks he used for the purpose and placed them wrapped in cloth against the soles of her feet and the inside of her wrists where the blood ran close to the surface. He had done this for a calf once, 2 winters back. The principle was the same. You warmed the edges first, so the center did not have to do the work alone. He sat in the chair beside her and watched her breathe, and every few minutes checked the color of her hands and lips and waited for the gray to leave them. It took 2 hours for the gray to leave. When it did, he went to the kitchen and made broth from the bone stock he kept on the back of the stove through the winter months, and he brought it back and set it where she could reach it when she woke. And then he went and told Lars what had happened and where the extra blankets were, in case Lars needed to know, which he might not, but Callan preferred to have things accounted for. Her name was Wren Cade. She told him that 4 days later, when she was well enough to sit up in the narrow bed in his spare room and drink the broth he brought without help. She said it plainly, the way someone says a thing they have said many times and expect nothing particular from. Wren Cade, out of Forsyth County. She had been traveling west on a freighting contract, hired to assess a mill operation 3 counties over, and the wagon she had been riding had thrown a wheel in the dark, and she had walked from where it went down until she could not walk anymore. Callan told her she had walked approximately 4 miles in a blizzard. She looked at the window. She said she had walked farther than that before. He believed her. Wren Cade was 34 years old, though she did not offer the number and he did not ask. He placed it from the quality of her steadiness, the way she moved when she was well enough to move, like someone who had long since finished deciding who she was going to be and was simply being it. She was not tall. She was built with the kind of economy that suggested everything she carried was there for a reason and nothing that was not had been kept. Her eyes were the particular gray of creek water in November, clear and direct and not unkind, but not soft either. She looked at things the way a person looked at things when they had learned that looking carefully was the difference between a good decision and a bad one. She did not ask for anything she did not need. She did not apologize for needing what she needed. The first morning she was well enough to eat solid food, she asked him plainly what he had in the house and what she was permitted to take from it, and he said, "Take whatever you want," and she said that was not a useful answer, and asked him to be specific about the kitchen stores. He appreciated the specificity. He told her what was in the larder by category and quantity, and she nodded and said she could work with that, and ate what she needed, and left the rest where it was. Her competence domain was mill assessment and timber valuation. She had come to it the way most women came to unusual work, through necessity first, and then through the discovery that she was better at it than most men she had encountered, which was a thing she had stopped being surprised about somewhere around her 28th year. Her father had run a small operation in Forsyth County, and she had learned the work at his side from the time she was old enough to hold a measuring rod. He had not taught her out of any particular theory about what women were capable of. He had taught her because she was there and she was interested, and he needed someone reliable to hand him the tools. And by the time she was 16, she was not handing him the tools anymore. She was telling him which ones to use. When he died, she had run the operation herself for 3 years before selling the equipment and the rights, and taking the knowledge on the road as the one thing no one could put a lien on. She had taken a correspondence course in mechanical engineering principles from a college in the East that did not ask the gender of its students before it sent the materials. She had spent a winter in a mill town in Ohio working as an unpaid assistant to the head millwright in exchange for access to the operations she could not otherwise have seen. She had built, over 8 years of contract work, a reputation that arrived ahead of her in the form of a letter from the last operator she had assessed, which she carried folded in the canvas bag and presented when her name and her appearance together produced the particular kind of skepticism she had learned to expect. She assessed grain mills, lumber mills, water-powered operations of every description. She could read a wheel and tell you how many years it had left before the housing cracked. She could look at a mill race and calculate the seasonal flow variation from the grade of the channel walls. She could examine a set of millstones and know within 2 grindings whether the furrow pattern had been dressed properly or whether the operator was running on ignorance and luck. She had saved 3 operations from bankruptcy by finding the problems the owners could not name, and 2 operations from fraud by finding discrepancies in the timber contracts that the owners had not known to look for. She was, in short, not a woman who needed to be rescued. She made this clear in the polite and matter-of-fact way she made most things clear, which was by saying what was true without apology and without softening it into something easier to receive. She thanked Callan for bringing her in from the cold. She told him she would be on her way within the week, as soon as she had sent word ahead to the mill she had been contracted to assess. She said she hoped she had not been too great an inconvenience. He told her she had not. He did not tell her that he had sat up until nearly 3 in the morning the first 2 nights, watching the color come back into her face and feeling something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time and could not immediately name. Callan Vore was 42 years old and had been running the Pale Creek operation for 14 years. Which meant he had been running it alone for 11 of those, since his brother Ned had taken his share of the inheritance in cash and headed to California. The operation was 340 acres of mixed-use land in the river corridor, a functioning mill on the Northern Creek branch, 200 head of cattle on the upland pastures, and a hay operation in the bottomland that kept the cattle through the winters that came hard and stayed long in this part of the territory. He had built most of what was on the property himself, either with his own hands or with the 2 hired men he kept on year-round, a taciturn Swede named Lars Gran and Lars's nephew Petter, who was 20 and enthusiastic in the way that 20-year-olds were enthusiastic before the work taught them the value of economy. He was not a man who said much. He had learned early that most of what needed saying could be said in fewer words than people generally used, and that the words left over were usually just noise that confused the situation. He was known in the valley as fair, which in the particular language of the territory meant he paid what he owed and expected what he was owed, and did not pretend the difference was smaller than it was. He was known as competent, which meant he had not made any of the catastrophic mistakes that had undone 3 of his neighbors in the past decade. He was not known as warm, which was not because he was not, but because warmth, in his experience, was a thing that required someone to give it to, and for 11 years there had not been anyone in particular. He noticed things. That was the quality that ran through everything else. He noticed when the creek level dropped 2 inches in a dry August and what it meant for the mill output. He noticed when Lars favored his left knee in cold weather and adjusted the work assignments accordingly before Lars had to ask. He noticed when the cattle moved to the south pasture in October 3 days before the first snow arrived, and he had learned to read that movement as the forecast it was. He had built the Pale Creek operation on this quality more than on any other. The willingness to look at what was actually in front of him and respond to it rather than to what he expected or hoped to find. He noticed, in the days after he brought Renkade in from the snow, that she categorized everything she saw. She did not appear to be doing it. She appeared to be simply looking. But her eyes moved over a room the way a surveyor's eyes moved over a piece of land, finding the reference points, calculating the relationships between them, building a picture that was more precise than it looked. She looked at the kitchen and saw the arrangement of the tools in relation to the stove and the worktable, and noted without comment that the most used items were the farthest from the fire. She looked at the spare room and assessed the angle of the morning light through the window and repositioned the bed without asking, 2 feet to the east, where the light would fall on the reading side rather than the sleeping side. She had done this in the first hour she was well enough to be on her feet, quietly, as a thing that made sense and therefore needed doing. He found this more interesting than he had expected to find anything in a long time. This is where a man pulls a half-frozen woman from the snow on his property line and discovers she came with skills that reach far past what he bargained for. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now. Then, back to the Pale Creek operation, where Renkade is 3 days out of a sickbed and already walking the mill. She was on her feet by the 5th day, which was sooner than he thought advisable, and exactly as soon as she had told him she would be. She borrowed one of his coats because her own was still stiff with what the cold had done to it, and she walked out to the mill on the Northern Creek branch without asking him to show her where it was. He watched her from the kitchen window, and then, after a moment, followed. The mill was a 12-year-old structure, sound in its bones but carrying the particular fatigue of a building that had been worked hard and maintained reactively rather than proactively. The wheel was a 14-foot overshot, well suited to the creek's seasonal volume, and it had been running reliably for a decade. What it had not been doing for the past 2 seasons was running at the efficiency it should have been. The output numbers were down. The grinding was uneven. Callan had consulted with a millwright from the county seat who had charged him $40 and told him the stones needed dressing, and he had had the stones dressed, and the problem had not improved. He had been sitting with that unresolved situation for 7 months. It was the kind of thing that occupied a portion of his attention in the way that unresolved things did, present at the back of every calculation he made about the operation, a variable he had not yet found the value for. He did not speak of it to Lars, because Lars did not know mills, and speaking of it would only produce the discomfort of a good man trying to be useful without the tools to be so. Ren walked the building the way she walked everything, with the deliberate, unhurried attention of someone who understood that a building told its own story if you let it. She started at the exterior, working around the perimeter of the structure, looking at the foundation and the wheel housing and the point where the mill race met the building wall. She crouched at the north corner and pressed her palm flat against the foundation timbers and held it there for a moment. She stood and looked up at the wheel housing and then at the angle of the millrace channel as it came off the main creek branch. She did not say anything for a long time. Callan stood back and watched and did not offer interpretation. She went inside. She walked the length of the mill floor and then stood still in the center of it with her eyes closed for a moment in a way that confused him until he understood she was listening. She was listening to the building run, reading the vibration pattern through the soles of her boots the way a doctor read a pulse. She moved to the stones and examined the furrow pattern with her fingers. Not cursorily, but with the focused attention of someone reading a language in the grooves. She pressed down on the runner stone at 3 separate points around its circumference and checked the gap at each point with a thin strip of paper she drew from the pocket of the borrowed coat. She went down to the wheel housing and looked at the bearing surfaces and the angle of the shaft and the clearance between the wheel and the housing wall. She looked at the shaft clearance for a long time. She came back up and said, "There is your problem." He waited. She told him the millwright had dressed the stones correctly and charged him fairly for it. She told him the problem was not the stones. The problem was that the wheel shaft had shifted in its housing over the past 3 winters, a slow migration caused by seasonal expansion and contraction in the foundation timber on the north side, which sat in shadow longer than the south and therefore held moisture longer and therefore expanded and contracted more. The shaft shift was barely measurable in any single season, but across 3 years it had accumulated to a degree that changed the angle of force transmission between the wheel and the stones by approximately 2 degrees. 2 degrees was enough to account for everything he had observed. The uneven grinding was a consequence of uneven pressure distribution across the stone face. The reduced output was a consequence of energy lost to friction at the shifted bearing. None of it was the stones. All of it was the foundation. She told him the fix was straightforward. Repack the north foundation with dry, set stone on the bottom course, which would even out the moisture behavior across the full perimeter. Reset the shaft in its housing once the foundation was stable, which would require shimming the bearing at 2 points to account for the accumulated migration. The work was 2 weeks if he had the hands for it, and the materials were not difficult to source: dry-set limestone in any quantity from the quarry road 10 miles west. She said it all in the tone of someone describing what was plainly there to see, not as someone who had found something surprising. Callan was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long have you known that?" She said, "Since the second time around the exterior perimeter." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back without any particular expression, waiting for whatever came next. Outside the mill, the creek moved under its skin of ice, and the wheel turned, and the shaft ran in its housing at the wrong angle, as it had been running for 3 winters, as it would have gone on running if she had not walked 4 miles in a blizzard and landed on his fence line. He said he would appreciate it if she would write down what she had told him before she left for the operation she had been contracted to, so he could reference it when he was doing the work. She said she would do better than that. She said she would show him. He had not expected her to say that. He was not certain what he had expected. He said the job she was going to was already contracted, and she had people waiting on her. She said she had already sent word that the assessment would be delayed by 10 days owing to weather and circumstance, and that the operation had written back to say they could wait. She said she did not start things she did not finish, and she had told him she would write down what she found, and a description on paper was not the same as making sure the work was done right, and she preferred to make sure. He did not argue with her. He was not sure there was an argument to make. Lars Gran and Petter were brought in on the project the following morning. Wren laid out the work sequence with the precision of someone who had coordinated labor before. assigning each man to a task that fit his strengths without making a point of having assessed those strengths, which she clearly had. She put Petter on the material sourcing and hauling because he had the energy for it and the kind of strength that did not yet know to be economical, which was the right kind of strength for moving quarry stone. She put Lars on the actual foundation work because she had seen in the first hour that Lars was someone whose hands knew what level felt like before the instrument confirmed it, and that kind of knowledge was what the foundation work required. She positioned herself between them, reading the level, calling the measurements, making the decisions that required someone to hold the whole picture in their head while the other two were looking at the part in front of them. Lars, who had strong opinions about the correct way to do most things and was usually right, listened to her without interruption, which Callan had never seen Lars do with anyone he had not worked alongside for at least a season. Petter watched her with the expression of a young man who was simultaneously confused and impressed and had not yet sorted out which of those feelings was in charge. The foundation work took 4 days. Ren worked alongside the men, not directing from a remove but in it, moving stone and mortar and packing material with the same economy she brought to everything. She could read a level with the accuracy of someone who had done it 10,000 times, which she probably had. She called out small corrections in angle and alignment in the same tone she used for everything, matter of fact and specific. And the corrections were always right, and after the second day Lars stopped looking to Callan to verify them, and simply made them. By the third day, Lars had begun offering information to her in the same manner he offered information to Colin, not asking permission to speak, not framing it as a suggestion, just stating what he saw and leaving it for her to use or set aside as she judged best. It was the highest form of professional respect Lars was capable of giving, and he gave it without appearing to notice he was giving it. Callan noticed. He noticed most things. On the 5th day they reset the shaft. It was precise work. The shaft had to be repositioned in the housing to account for the correction the foundation repair had made, and the margin for error was small. Ren guided the positioning by feel and measurement both, checking and rechecking the alignment with a plumb bob and a measuring rod and something else that seemed to be located in her hands, a knowledge of what correctly fitted parts felt like that went below the level of measurement into the body. She had Callan hold the shaft steady at the housing end while she worked the bearing points, and his hands were 6 inches from hers for the better part of an hour, and neither of them acknowledged this, but he was aware of it in a way that had nothing to do with the shaft and everything to do with the proximity of someone whose attention was something you could feel in a room even when it was directed at something other than you. When it was done, she ran the mill empty for 2 hours and walked the floor listening and said nothing. And when the 2 hours were up, she said that was it. Callan ran a test grind the following morning. The output was better than it had been in 3 years. Not slightly better. Measurably, clearly, unmistakably better. He stood in the mill watching the grain move through and felt something he did not immediately have a word for, which was the particular sensation of a problem that had been sitting on him for 2 seasons, lifting off all at once. The grinding was even. The wheel ran smooth. The sound of the operation was the sound it was supposed to be, which he recognized the way a man recognized a voice he had not heard in a long time, by the feeling of rightness rather than by conscious recollection. He went back to the house. Ren was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper she was writing on, the notes she had promised him about the long-term maintenance schedule for keeping the foundation stable. She did not look up when he came in. She said, "How did it run?" He said it ran well. She made a small sound that might have been satisfaction and went back to writing. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and did not say anything for a while, which was the most comfortable silence he had sat in for 11 years. "Tell me this," When Ren Cade laid out the mill problem for Callan Vore in that plain and complete way, stating not just the diagnosis but the fix, the timeline, and the cost, she was doing something that most people in that situation would not have done. She gave him everything. She did not hold back the key detail, did not make herself necessary by making the solution dependent on her continued presence. She gave him the whole answer free and clear, and told him she would write it down so he would have it without her. What does it tell you about a person that the first thing they do with hard-won knowledge is give it away completely? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Now back to the Pale Creek operation, where the days after the mill repair have begun to accumulate in ways neither of them has named. She stayed 10 days past the mill repair. This was not precisely what she had said she would do. She had said she would stay to show him the work, and the work was done, and she stayed anyway, and neither of them made particular note of it. The days had a shape to them. Callan was up before dawn, as he had always been. But now there was coffee already made when he came downstairs, which had not been the case before, and which he did not comment on and did not take for granted. She had established that she woke earlier than he did, something he discovered the second morning when he came down to find her already at the table with a book open in front of her and the stove lit and the coffee done. She did not explain it, and he did not ask. He simply poured a cup and sat down, and that was how mornings became a thing they did in the same room without discussing having decided to. She took her meals with him. This had started out of practical necessity when she was recovering and he was bringing food to the spare room, and it had simply continued as she moved from the spare room to the table. Lars and Petter ate in the bunkhouse as they always had, and nothing was said about the new arrangement, and nothing needed to be. She cooked 3 times in the first week, and each time she cooked it was good, not in a performing way, but in the way of someone who understood that food was fuel and treated it accordingly. With the efficiency of a person who did not waste effort, but did not cut corners either. She made a venison stew on the second Tuesday that was better than anything he had produced from the same ingredients in 14 years of cooking for himself, and when he said so, she said it was the bay leaves and the order of the vegetables and left it at that. She helped where she could see help was needed. This was not a calculated thing. She did not survey the operation and make a plan. She simply noticed, as she moved through the days, when something needed doing that she could do, and she did it. She reorganized the supply shed with a system that made more sense than the one it had, grouping items by frequency of use rather than by category, so the things reached for daily were at the front and the things reached for seasonally were at the back. And she told Lars what she had done and why so that he would know where things were, because the shed was his territory, and she understood that. She looked at the hay figures and found an error in the seasonal projection that would have resulted in a shortfall by February, and she corrected it, and showed Callan the correction, and told him what to order and by when. She looked at the cattle records one evening while he was doing the accounts, and said the 3-year-old roan heifer that had been listed as a poor producer since the previous fall had been listed that way because she had been assessed during the 2 months she was nursing a calf that had since been weaned, and her production numbers since the weaning, which were recorded in a separate column that the summary did not include, were above average. He looked at where she was pointing and confirmed that she was right. She had been looking at the records for 20 minutes. She did not present any of these things as favors. She presented them as things that needed doing, that she had happened to notice. The distinction mattered to her in a way he could see without her explaining it. She was not building credit with him. She was not making herself indispensable by accumulation. She was simply doing what she did wherever she was, which was to see what was in front of her and respond to it. He watched all of this. He watched it the way he watched the creek level and the cattle movement and the behavior of the sky in the hour before weather changed, which was with the attention of someone who understood that what things did was what things were. What Renkei did was notice and act and tell the truth plainly, and not need anything from him that she had not earned by the work she put in. He had not met many people like that in his life. He was not sure he had met any. There were evenings by the fire when she read, and he worked on the account books, and the silence was the kind that accumulated like capital, quietly and without drama, building into something with weight. She asked questions when she had them, precise questions that required precise answers, and she listened to the answers with the quality of attention she gave to everything, complete and without distraction. She told him things about the mill operations she had assessed over the years, not as stories exactly, more as information that happened to have narrative shape, a mill in a river town that had been profitable on paper and bankrupt in practice, because the operator had been reporting capacity rather than actual throughput. A timber contract in the hill country that had been calculated against the wrong species yield table, costing the landowner nearly a third of what his timber was worth. She told these things the way she told everything, plainly, without drama, letting the facts carry whatever weight they had. He listened the same way she listened to him and felt the particular pleasure of being heard by someone who was actually paying attention. He had not had that in 11 years either. He had not known he was missing it until it was present. Once, on the 8th evening, after the mill repair, she looked up from her book and said without preamble that she had not stayed in any one place for more than 3 weeks in 6 years. She said it in the tone she used for facts, which was the only tone she had. He said that was a long time to be moving. She looked at the fire for a moment and then back at her book and said, "It was." He did not press. He did not have a position on the matter that he was ready to put into words. What he had was an awareness, sitting in his chest without demanding resolution, that the spare room had been empty for 11 years before she was in it, and that the prospect of it being empty again had a weight he had not anticipated and was not sure what to do with. He was a man who dealt well with situations that could be assessed and acted on. This was not yet one of those. Petter asked him one morning, with the transparency of someone who had not yet learned to obscure his thinking, whether the woman who had fixed the mill was planning to stay on. Callan said he did not know. Petter said she seemed to know more about the operation than most people who had been here for years. Callan said she was observant. Petter looked at him for a moment and then went back to work with the expression of someone who had received less information than he had hoped for, which was accurate. Lars said nothing on the subject, which with Lars meant he had an opinion he had decided not to share, which meant the opinion was favorable, because Lars only withheld favorable opinions. Unfavorable ones he delivered without being asked. The day she said she was leaving was a Thursday. The sky was the particular flat white that meant snow was coming by afternoon, and she looked at it when she came out to breakfast and said she would need to be on the road by mid-morning if she was going to make the valley road before the weather hit. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, as if it were a logistical problem she had solved and was now reporting the solution of. He said he would get Abel saddled and ride out with her to the property line to make sure she was on the right heading. She said that was not necessary. She said she knew the heading. He said he knew she knew it. He said he would ride out anyway. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she used when she was assessing something that did not fit neatly into the category she had been placing it in, and then said all right. They rode the eastern fence line in the thin, cold morning light, the same fence line where he had found her 3 weeks before. The same gray light and the same cold and the same cedar posts shouldered in drifted snow. When they reached the corner post, she stopped her horse and looked out at the road beyond the property and was quiet. He was quiet too. He was not a man who filled silences with words that did not belong there, and the silence here did not need filling. The road beyond the property line was visible as a slight compression in the snow between the fence and the tree line, the track of previous passage not quite obliterated by the new drifts. It went west and then bent south. And 3 counties over there was a mill that needed assessing, and a letter of contract in her canvas bag, and a life that moved through places rather than staying in them. After a moment, she said she had left the maintenance notes on the kitchen table for him, the long ones she had promised. Not just the mill, but the hay projections, and the supply schedule, and the calculation she had done on the north pasture fence that was going to need replacing in the spring. She had spent the previous evening writing them out in the careful, precise hand she used for everything. 4 pages of specific instruction covering every variable she had identified in 3 weeks of attention. He said he had seen them. She said the mill would need the shaft bearing checked every September before the winter load came on. She said it was a 20-minute job if you did it annually and a 2-week job if you let it go. He said he would remember that. She said the East Bottomland had better hay potential than the current operation was using. The soil in the lower third was richer than the upper section, and it was getting the same seed mix, which was not the right choice. She said if someone put the right seed in the lower third in April, the yield difference would be apparent by the first cutting. He said he had been thinking the same thing about that section for 2 years. She said she knew. She said she had seen it in the way he had marked it differently in the field records, a small notation in the margin that did not match the notation for the rest of the bottomland. She said she was not sure he had known consciously that he was marking it that way. He considered this for a moment. He said he was not sure he had. She turned and looked at him directly, which was how she looked at everything, without deflection or performance, and there was something in her expression that had not been there in the first week. A quality that was not quite openness, but was the thing adjacent to it. The look of someone who had decided a door was worth walking through, even if they could not see what was on the other side. She said Callan. He said Wren. When he said her name, it carried everything she had shown him in 3 weeks without his being able to say he had been looking for any of it. It carried the mill and the stones and the 4 days of foundation work in, the cold and the morning coffee already made when he came downstairs, and the bay leaves in the stew, and the hay figure corrected before it became a problem, and the roan heifer restored to her correct column, and the evenings by the fire, when the silence between them had been the most comfortable thing he had felt in 11 years. It carried the way she told the truth without apology, and helped without making a performance of it, and held her knowledge with the ease of someone who knew what she knew and did not need anyone to confirm it. When he said her name, it was all of that at once, compressed into one syllable, and she heard it that way. He could see that she did. When she said his name, it carried what she had observed across 3 weeks of the kind of attention she gave to everything that mattered to her. It carried the man who had ridden out to check a fence in the dark of a blizzard morning and found something impossible and made a decision about it in 30 seconds without drama and without requiring the situation to be anything other than what it was. It carried the man who had stood back at the mill and let her work without interrupting or second-guessing or needing to be the one who understood, and who had said it ran well when it ran well, and left the rest unsaid because the rest was already known. It carried 11 years of an operation built with the kind of quiet competence that left marks on everything it touched. The well-maintained buildings and the well-kept accounts and the field notation in the margin that he had not consciously known he was making. And Lars Gran, who trusted him, and Petter, who was learning from him, and the land itself, which was in better condition than when he had started because he paid attention to what it needed and responded to what he found. When she said his name, it was all of that, and underneath it something simpler and more unguarded, which was that she had not slept as well in 6 years as she had slept in the spare room of this house, and she had been paying enough attention to know why. She said she had not expected to stay 3 weeks when she woke up in his spare room. He said he had not expected to find her in the snow. She said she supposed neither of them had planned for any of it. He said that was true. He said he had also not planned to find out what it felt like to have someone in the house who noticed the same things he noticed and told him what she found without making him feel that the noticing was a performance for his benefit. He said finding that out had made the prospect of its absence considerably less acceptable than it would have been if he had not found it out, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said he was aware that she had work contracted elsewhere and a life that moved and did not stay in one place. He said he was not asking her to set that down entirely. He said he was asking her to consider whether this place, specifically this operation with its shifted shaft now running true and its east bottomland planted wrong and its north pasture fence due for replacement in spring, was a place that had enough in it to hold someone whose attention ran as deep as hers did. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the cedar post, the one she had been reaching toward when he found her, the one she had stretched her hand out to in the dark and the cold before her legs had given out. She looked at the road beyond the property line. She turned and looked at the house and the mill and the winter pasture and the line of the creek along the north boundary. And she looked at all of it the way she looked at everything, with the complete and unsentimental attention of someone taking inventory of what was actually there. She said the north foundation would need checking every 3 years, not just the mill shaft. He said he was aware. She said the hay operation had room to expand if someone with time to manage it looked at the east bottomland in spring and put the right seed in the lower third before the ground froze again. He said he had thought so too. She said the supply shed was better organized now, but the system would only hold if whoever was using it maintained the categories. She said Lars would maintain them if he understood the logic, and she thought he did, but someone would need to check the first spring inventory to confirm it had held through the winter. He said he could check the spring inventory. She said the roan heifer's production numbers should be reconciled into the main herd record before the year-end accounting, or the annual summary would underreport the true herd productivity by a figure that would compound incorrectly into the 5-year projection. He said he would take care of that this week. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, but was its own thing. Clear and direct, and without any of the softening that people put on things when they wanted them to land more gently. She said she supposed there was enough here to keep her occupied for some time, as if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. He did not say anything to that. There was nothing that needed saying. The snow that had been building in the flat white sky began to fall, quietly, in the way that serious snow started, without announcement, a few flakes first, and then more, and then the particular hush that came when the air was fully committed to what it was doing. Abel shifted his weight and blew out a breath that fogged in the cold. The borrowed coat she was still wearing hung open at the collar, and she did not appear to notice the cold, which was something he had observed about her from the first, that she did not spend energy on discomfort she could not address, and simply accounted for it and moved on. The mill on the northern branch made its low, steady sound through the winter quiet. Running true for the first time in 3 years, the wheel turning in its housing at the correct angle, the stones meeting at the correct pressure, the grain moving through at the output it was supposed to produce. The sound of a thing working the way it was built to work. She turned her horse back toward the house. He turned Abel and rode beside her, and the snow came down around them on the property she had found her way to in the dark. And the kitchen was ahead of them, and the operation was on every side, and the east bottomland was waiting for the right seed in spring. And neither of them was going anywhere. And the matter was settled, and it held.